The palace was silent, but the weight of the world pressed down on Ibrahim Traoré's shoulders. Outside, his people starved, families collapsing from hunger, children with eyes too tired to cry. Inside, a letter from the IMF demanded half of Burkina Faso's gold or the aid would vanish overnight. And as Traoré read the ultimatum, whispers spread through the corridors. His own cousin was plotting against him. One choice could save his people, but betray Africa. Another could defy the West, but cost him everything, even his life. The clock was ticking, and in that moment, betrayal was closer than he ever imagined. Ibrahim Traoré was not born into luxury, nor shielded by privilege. He rose from the same soil that baked under the relentless Sahel sun, from the same villages where families lived day to day with courage, hunger, and hope intertwined. When he became leader, he carried on his shoulders not just the authority of a president, but the burden of a father figure to millions who had been betrayed too many times before. Burkina Faso was a nation that bled quietly. For decades, foreign powers had carved it open, draining its veins of gold and cotton while leaving its people in darkness. Poverty was not an accident here. It was engineered. Sanctions tightened like shackles around its economy, ensuring that the wealth buried beneath the earth never reached the hands of those who tilled it. Entire villages survived on one meal a day, and mothers prayed that one bowl of rice could somehow stretch to feed 6 children. War only deepened the wound. Rebel groups funded from beyond the borders swept through rural towns, torching fields, displacing families, and spreading terror. The people cried out for justice, for security, for someone who would finally stand in defiance of the endless cycle of exploitation. Traoré answered. From the moment he took power, he did not speak as a politician, but as a soldier, a protector. He was young, fearless, and unyielding. In his speeches, he did not promise wealth or luxury. He promised dignity. And for the first time in decades, the people believed those words. They saw in him not just a leader, but a son of the land, a man who would stand between them and the vultures circling above. But hope came at a cost. Traoré's rise ignited rage in distant capitals. Western leaders and financial institutions, long accustomed to Africa's compliance, saw his defiance as a threat. The International Monetary Fund whispered its demands: deliver your gold, surrender your sovereignty, or watch your people starve. Behind those words was a weapon more devastating than bombs: economic strangulation. Inside his palace, the weight of betrayal thickened. Some within his own ranks questioned his defiance. Whispers of discontent grew louder, carried by men who once swore loyalty. And among those whispers, one name rose like a knife in the dark. His own cousin, a man bound to him by blood yet tempted by promises of wealth and power. Traoré stood at the crossroads of history. His people looked to him as their shield, but every path before him was lined with fire. Yield to the IMF, and Burkina Faso might breathe for another season, but at the price of submission. Defy them, and he risked unleashing hunger, rebellion, and even assassination. The world was watching. His enemies were circling. His family was fracturing. And somewhere in the shadows of Ouagadougou, his cousin's betrayal was already in motion. The sun over Ouagadougou was merciless that season. Crops withered under skies that once promised rain but now mocked the people with clouds that never broke. The streets grew quieter with every passing week, not because life improved, but because despair had driven many families into silence. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter. Fathers stared at empty markets where food once lined the stalls. Hunger was no longer a threat. It was a reality that gnawed at the very bones of Burkina Faso. Traoré watched these scenes unfold, from armored vehicles as he traveled from one province to another. His soldiers, many barely older than the children they swore to protect, stood in fatigues patched with old cloth, carrying rifles that belonged to another generation of wars. Yet their eyes were fierce with loyalty, their voices unshaken as they declared, "We will not surrender, President." But loyalty could not fill stomachs, and courage could not cook rice. Behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. Envoys from Paris, Washington, and Brussels sent their messages cloaked in politeness but sharp as blades. Partnership, they called it. Stability, they promised. But the fine print was always the same. Give us control of your gold mines, grant us access to your fields, sign away your independence, and in return, we will feed your starving people. Then came the IMF. Their letter arrived under heavy seal, but its contents spread through the palace like wildfire. 50% of Burkina Faso's reserves, they demanded, if the nation wished to access humanitarian aid and international markets. The message was clear: compliance or collapse. Traoré's advisors gathered in the war room, their voices rising. In panic. Some urged him to sign immediately, arguing that survival mattered more than pride. If we lose the people to hunger, one general whispered, we lose the nation. Others, hardened by years of exploitation, spat at the idea. It is slavery disguised as aid, they warned. We cannot surrender again. But the most dangerous voices were not those who spoke in the open. Rumors swirled that traitors within his own palace had begun secret conversations with Western officials. Names of officers once trusted began to surface. And at the heart of those whispers was a man who carried Traoré's own blood, his cousin. Raised in the same village, once a brother in arms, now a shadow with ambitions of his own. The betrayal cut deeper than any foreign threat. To fight outsiders was expected, but to battle kin was a wound that reached the soul. Traoré confronted his cousin in the palace gardens one evening beneath the faint glow of lanterns. His cousin smiled with the politeness of family, but his eyes betrayed something colder. The people need bread, he said quietly, and the West offers it. Refuse them, and you will watch Burkina Faso starve. The words hung heavy, not as advice, but as a warning. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, starvation carved scars across the land. In the northern provinces, villages emptied as families fled toward cities in search of food. Mothers wrapped belts around their waists to silence the growling of empty stomachs so their children could eat first. In the capital, a boy no older than 10 collapsed in the marketplace, his body too weak to rise. Traoré heard the news that night and slammed his fists against the table. For all his speeches of dignity and defiance, the reality of suffering haunted him. And still, the rebels came. Armed with foreign weapons, they struck convoys, looted granaries, and left behind ashes where farms once thrived. Each attack stole, not only lives, but also hope. Soldiers, exhausted and hungry themselves, carried comrades on stretchers, whispering prayers into the dust. Their letters home spoke not of victory, but of longing. Tell my mother I fought for her. Tell my sister to be strong. Everywhere he turned, the walls closed in. His generals urged compromise. His cousin whispered betrayal. The IMF tightened its grip, and his people cried for relief. Yet Traoré knew the truth hidden beneath the promises. The aid offered by the West was not salvation, it was a leash. To accept would buy him time, but at the cost of chains that might never break. The nights grew longer. Alone in his study, maps spread before him. Traoré stared at the borders of Burkina Faso. To the north, chaos. To the south, poverty. To the west, foreign corporations waiting like vultures. His nation was encircled, not only by geography, but by hunger, by betrayal, by the relentless pull of history repeating itself. The decision weighed heavier each day. If he resisted, thousands could die from famine before relief arrived. If he surrendered, he might save lives in the short term but condemn his country to decades of foreign control. Either path demanded sacrifice, but only one preserved dignity. And then came the breaking point. Late one night, the palace guards intercepted a messenger carrying sealed documents. When opened, the papers revealed a chilling plan. A coup in the making, backed by foreign sponsors, with his cousin's signature among the conspirators. The betrayal was no longer rumor. It was reality. Traoré stared at the papers in silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, rattling the palace windows like the heartbeat of a storm. Hunger was at his gates, rebellion in his streets, and betrayal in his own blood. Now, there could be no more waiting. The moment had come to decide, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the future of Africa itself. The storm that had been threatening Ouagadougou finally broke. Sheets of rain battered the palace roof, drumming like war drums, as if the skies themselves demanded a decision. In the grand chamber, Traoré stood before his council. The intercepted documents spread across the table. His cousin's signature, his own bloodline, marked the betrayal. The silence was suffocating. Every eye turned to him, waiting, fearful, desperate for direction. Traoré raised the papers high, his voice sharp as steel. These are not rumors. These are the truths that bleed our nation. While our children starve, while our soldiers die, with rifles older than they are, the West waits for us to surrender. And now, his fist trembled as he slammed the papers down. Now they have found willing hands inside this very palace. Gasps filled the chamber. His cousin shifted in, his seat calm yet cornered, his eyes calculating every exit. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Traoré's heart pounded, not just from anger, but from grief. This was not an enemy across the sea. This was family. But there was no turning back. He gave the order. Guards stormed forward, seizing his cousin before the man could utter a word. Shouts and protests echoed through the chamber, but Traoré's voice cut through them all. Betrayal will no longer wear the mask of kinship. From this day, we will not bow, not to family, not to foreign chains, not to hunger disguised as charity. The council erupted, some horrified, others electrified. In that instant, Traoré made it clear. Hesitation was over. The next morning, as dawn broke over a city cloaked in storm clouds, Traoré called the nation to the square. Tens of thousands gathered despite the rain, their bodies soaked, their stomachs empty, but their eyes burning with expectation. Soldiers lined the edges, their uniforms tattered, their weapons clutched like relics of survival. Mothers carried children on their backs, fathers held faded flags, and elders stood tall, leaning on canes that had witnessed generations of struggle. When Traoré stepped onto the platform, the crowd fell silent. His voice carried across the square, raw and unflinching. They say we must sell our gold to eat. They say we must give our land to survive. They say we must surrender our future to save our present. But I ask you, what is survival without dignity? What is bread bought with chains? What is life if we live it as slaves to the very hands that once colonized us? The crowd shifted, restless, murmurs spreading like sparks. The rain beat harder, but no one moved. Traoré raised his fist. I have rejected their terms. I have torn their papers. I will not sign away our future. Burkina Faso will stand, not as a pawn, not as a servant, but as a free nation, even if it means hunger, even if it means sacrifice. Better to suffer, standing, than to kneel and eat from a master's hand. The square erupted in thunderous cries, some of defiance, others of fear. Mothers wept, not knowing whether their children would eat tomorrow. Soldiers cheered, ready to fight, but also knowing their rations were nearly gone. The choice Traoré made was not one of comfort. It was war, but the boldest move was still to come. That evening, he summoned his generals, his ministers, and the surviving officers he could trust. He unveiled a plan so audacious it seemed like madness, to rally not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa still shackled by economic chains. Letters were already drafted to Mali, Niger, Guinea, nations resisting the same invisible empire, an African coalition, born not in luxury halls but in the mud and hunger of their people. This is no longer only about Burkina Faso, he declared. This is about every African child born under the shadow of debt, every farmer robbed of his harvest, every soldier forced to fight with weapons bought from the very powers that enslave us. Tonight we do not beg. Tonight we lead. The generals stared, torn between awe and terror. To reject the IMF outright was defiance. To rally Africa against it was provocation. It would mark Burkina Faso not just as disobedient, but as dangerous, a nation too bold to control, and the West would not tolerate it. But Traoré's voice never wavered. If they come for us, let them. If they starve us, let them try. The spirit of a free people cannot be starved. And if I must give my life for that spirit, then let this be the day history begins to remember us. Outside, the city roared with unrest. Some cheered his words as salvation. Others feared them as the beginning of ruin. Bread was still scarce. Hunger was still real. Yet the people now carried something heavier than starvation. Hope, fierce and reckless. But hope, Traoré knew, was a double-edged sword. For every loyal soldier there was a traitor waiting. For every cheering crowd, there was a foreign agent watching. And in the shadows of the storm, alliances were already shifting. Word of his defiance raced across the world like wildfire. In Paris, ministers whispered of sanctions. In Washington, advisors spoke of regime change. In Brussels, diplomats drafted statements cloaked in the language of stability. The vultures were circling, faster now, sharper now. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré returned to his private chamber that night. Alone with the storm still raging outside, he stood by the window staring at his reflection in the glass. He had made his choice. There was no way back. Somewhere in the palace, His cousin sat in chains. Somewhere in the city, children went to bed hungry. Somewhere in the fields, soldiers loaded rifles and whispered prayers. And somewhere across the oceans, powerful men plotted his downfall. He whispered to himself, not a prayer, but a promise. If this is the price of freedom, then let history know we paid it. Then, as lightning cracked the sky, a messenger burst into the room. His face was pale, his words urgent. President, they've moved. Foreign forces, sanctions, embargoes, and something worse. They're coming. The room fell silent. The storm outside howled like a warning. Traoré turned slowly, his eyes burning with resolve. He had made his boldest move. But now the consequences were on his doorstep. The point of no return had been crossed. At home in Burkina Faso, the immediate consequences were brutal. Western banks froze accounts. Foreign aid shipments vanished overnight. The IMF declared Burkina Faso in violation of agreements and barred it from global credit markets. Within days, fuel prices doubled. Medicines disappeared from clinics. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and mothers whispered fearful questions to one another. Had their leader doomed them? Yet amid the hardship, something else stirred. In markets where vendors once grumbled of hunger, voices now rang with words never spoken so loudly: dignity, sovereignty, freedom. The poorest farmers began to wear the Burkinabe flag on their sleeves. Soldiers, though under-equipped, marched with a renewed sense of purpose. Children painted Traoré's image on school walls, calling him le bouclier du peuple, the people's shield. And beyond Burkina Faso's borders, his defiance lit a fire. In Mali, students flooded the streets with chants, "We will not kneel." In Niger, trade unions declared a boycott of Western goods. In Guinea, soldiers raised their rifles skyward in salute to Ouagadougou. Even in distant corners of Africa, long silenced by debt and dependency, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Traoré's gamble had done more than reject a contract. It had awakened a continent. But inspiration comes at a cost. The Western powers, furious at the breach of obedience, unleashed their arsenal not of tanks but of isolation. Sanctions multiplied. Trade routes closed, and foreign media outlets painted Traoré as a reckless tyrant leading his people into ruin. Commentators in Paris and Washington warned of instability. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies debated ways to remove him, quietly, permanently. Inside his own government, pressure mounted. Some ministers begged him to reconsider, to sign even a partial agreement with the IMF, to buy breathing room for the people. Others whispered darker thoughts, plots of another coup, another betrayal, another palace guard willing to sell loyalty for dollars. Traoré bore it all in silence. Each night, he walked the corridors of the palace alone, listening to the echo of his boots against the stone, wondering if history would remember him as a liberator or a fool. But then came a moment no embargo could silence. A letter arrived, hand-delivered by a delegation from Mali and Niger. In it, their leaders pledged solidarity, not just in words, but in action. They would share resources, form joint security commands, and together, push for an economic alliance independent of Western control. Days later, Guinea joined them. A new bloc was born, fragile, imperfect, but alive. The world had scoffed at Traoré's vision of an African coalition. Now, before the eyes of millions, it was becoming reality. In the streets of Ouagadougou, when news of the alliance spread, thousands poured into the night, torches in hand, drums echoing through the city. Yes, hunger remained. Yes, sanctions still cut deep. But the people saw something hunger could not starve, the possibility of a future owned by themselves. Meanwhile, in the West, unease turned into alarm. Reports flooded intelligence desks, African, youth waving flags of solidarity, soldiers pledging loyalty to a new cause, governments reconsidering their ties. Economists warned of a dangerous precedent. If one nation could defy the IMF and survive, others might follow. And if others followed, control would slip. The struggle was far from over. But the balance of power had shifted, if only slightly, toward those who had been voiceless for generations. For Traoré, the cost remained personal. His cousin languished in a cell, a reminder that betrayal often came closest to home. Food shortages still haunted his people. Every decision weighed on him like a stone, every misstep a potential catastrophe. Yet when he walked into the square and saw the eyes of his people, starving, yes, but unbroken, he knew the gamble had been worth it, because in that square, no one called him weak. No one called him a puppet. They called him something far rarer. Leader. History will debate his legacy. Some will argue he endangered his nation by defying powers too great. Others will say he ignited a new age of African resistance. But one truth remains unshakable. Ibrahim Traoré stood when it was easier to kneel, and that act alone carved his name into the stone of history. And as the fires of hope spread across the continent, one question lingered. If one man in a small nation could shake the empire of debt, what happens when an entire continent rises together?